My wife left me for my oncologist during my cancer treatment. The medical ethics board made sure he'd never practice medicine again. The diagnosis hit me like a freight train on a Tuesday morning in March. I was 34 years old, thought I was invincible, and suddenly I'm sitting in a sterile office being told I have stage 3 lymphoma. The words bounced around my head like pinballs while my wife sat next to me, her hand gripping mine so tight I thought she might break my fingers. We drove home in complete silence, both of us processing what felt like a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. The first few weeks were a blur of appointments, blood tests, and conversations with insurance companies that made my head spin. My wife became my rock during those early days, driving me to every appointment, taking notes when my brain felt too foggy to process information, and researching treatment options until 3 in the morning. She quit her part-time job to focus on being my caregiver, and I felt guilty about the financial strain even though she insisted it was the right thing to do. My oncologist was younger than I expected, probably in his early 40s, with graying temples and the kind of confident demeanor that made you believe everything would be okay. He explained my treatment plan with patience and clarity, breaking down complex medical concepts into language I could understand. During those first few appointments, I noticed how my wife hung on his every word, asking detailed questions about side effects and treatment timelines. I was grateful she was so engaged because honestly, half the time I felt like I was underwater, struggling to keep my head above the waves of information. The chemotherapy started in April, and it was every bit as brutal as I'd feared. The nausea hit me like a sledgehammer, leaving me hunched over the toilet for hours at a time. My hair started falling out in clumps, clogging the shower drain and appearing on my pillow every morning like unwelcome confetti. The fatigue was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, making simple tasks like taking a shower feel like climbing Mount Everest. My wife handled it all with grace, bringing me crackers and ginger ale, cleaning up after me when I couldn't make it to the bathroom in time, and holding my hand during the worst moments. But somewhere around my 6th treatment session, something shifted. My wife started spending more time getting ready for my appointments, choosing outfits more carefully and applying makeup with extra precision. She began asking our oncologist personal questions during visits, inquiring about his background, his family, his hobbies. I initially thought she was just being friendly, maybe trying to humanize the man who held my life in his hands. Looking back, I realize I was naive about what was actually happening right in front of me. The conversations between them became longer and more animated, while I sat there feeling like a third wheel in my own medical care. She would laugh at his jokes that weren't particularly funny, touch his arm when making a point, and maintain eye contact for uncomfortably long periods. I started feeling invisible during my own appointments, watching this strange dance unfold between my wife and the man who was supposed to be focused on saving my life. When I mentioned my concerns to her, she brushed them off as paranoia brought on by the stress of treatment. During my 8th round of chemotherapy, I overheard them making plans to meet for coffee to discuss my treatment options. This struck me as odd because we'd never needed separate meetings before, and all my treatment discussions had always included both of us. When I asked about it, my wife explained that she wanted to get a better understanding of the long-term prognosis, so she could be more supportive. It sounded reasonable on the surface, but something in her tone made my stomach churn in a way that had nothing to do with the chemo. The coffee meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon while I was home recovering from treatment. My wife came back 3 hours later, glowing with an energy I hadn't seen in months. She talked excitedly about how reassuring the conversation had been, how confident she felt about my prognosis, and how much she appreciated having someone who really understood what we were going through. That night, she was more affectionate than she'd been since my diagnosis, kissing me goodnight with an intensity that felt almost desperate. Over the next few weeks, these coffee meetings became more frequent. My wife would leave for what she called treatment planning sessions and return hours later with flushed cheeks and stories about medical breakthroughs that sounded suspiciously vague. She started receiving text messages at odd hours, always from him according to her explanations, usually about scheduling or test results. When I asked to see these messages, she would get defensive, claiming I was letting the cancer treatment make me paranoid and suspicious. The breaking point came during my 10th treatment session. I was feeling particularly weak that day, and my wife had stepped out to make a phone call. When she returned, I could hear her finishing a conversation that sounded nothing like a discussion about medical scheduling. She was laughing softly, speaking in hushed tones, and using words like sweetheart and can't wait to see you. When she noticed me listening, she quickly ended the call and claimed it was her sister checking on my progress. That evening, I confronted her directly about what I'd overheard. The conversation escalated quickly, with her accusing me of being paranoid and controlling, while I pressed for honest answers about her relationship with my oncologist. She finally broke down and admitted that they developed feelings for each other, but insisted nothing physical had happened. She claimed they were just supporting each other through the emotional challenges of cancer treatment, that he understood the pressure she was under in ways that I couldn't. I felt like I'd been punched in the guts. Here I was fighting for my life, and my wife was falling in love with another man. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd experienced during treatment. I couldn't understand how she could develop romantic feelings for someone while I was literally dying in front of her. The man who was supposed to be my lifeline had become the person stealing my wife's heart, and I felt powerless to stop it. We spent the next few days in a cold war of silence and tension. My wife continued taking me to appointments, but the dynamic had completely changed. She was distant and distracted, checking her phone constantly and making excuses to step out of the room. My oncologist seemed uncomfortable during our sessions, avoiding eye contact and rushing through explanations that had previously been thorough and patient. I felt like I was watching my marriage dissolve in real time while simultaneously fighting for my life. The situation exploded during my 11th treatment session. I was alone in the infusion room when my wife and oncologist walked in together, holding hands and looking like they'd been caught red-handed. They immediately dropped their hands and tried to act professional, but the damage was done. I could see the guilt written all over their faces, and I realized that their relationship had progressed far beyond emotional support and coffee meetings. I demanded to speak with my wife privately, and she reluctantly agreed to step outside with me. In the hallway of the cancer center, surrounded by other patients and their families, she confessed that she'd been having an affair with my oncologist for the past month. She claimed it wasn't planned, that they'd connected over their shared concern for my well-being, and that their relationship had developed naturally. She insisted she still loved me, but admitted she was no longer in love with me, that the stress of my illness had changed our relationship in ways she couldn't handle. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. Here I was in the middle of chemotherapy, learning that my wife was leaving me for the man who was supposed to be saving my life. The irony was almost too much to process. I asked her how long she'd been planning to leave, and she admitted she'd been thinking about it for weeks but hadn't known how to tell me. She claimed she'd waited until my treatment was almost finished because she didn't want to abandon me during the worst part of my illness. The conversation that followed was brutal and heartbreaking. My wife explained that she felt like she'd lost herself in the role of caregiver, that she'd put her own needs aside for so long that she'd forgotten who she was outside of my illness. She said my oncologist made her feel alive again, that he saw her as a person rather than just a patient's wife. She acknowledged that the timing was terrible and that she felt guilty about the situation, but she claimed she couldn't help her feelings. I was devastated but also furious. Not only was I dealing with cancer, but now I had to process the end of my marriage and the professional betrayal of my doctor. I felt like everyone in my life was abandoning me when I needed them most. The man who was supposed to be focused on my health and recovery was instead focused on stealing my wife. The woman who'd promised to stand by me in sickness and in health was walking away during the sickest period of my life. That night, my wife packed a bag and left our house. She moved in with a friend temporarily while she figured out her next steps. I was left alone with my cancer, my chemotherapy side effects, and the wreckage of my marriage. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own crying and the hum of the refrigerator. I'd never felt so alone in my entire life, and I wasn't sure how I was going to get through the remaining treatments without my support system. The next morning, I called the cancer center and requested a different oncologist. I explained that there had been a conflict of interest with my current doctor, and I needed to be transferred to someone else immediately. The scheduling coordinator seemed confused, but agreed to arrange a meeting with another oncologist for later that week. I didn't go into details about the affair, but I made it clear that I could no longer work with my current doctor under any circumstances. My new oncologist was a woman in her 50s, with a no-nonsense attitude and extensive experience treating lymphoma. She reviewed my file and treatment history, assuring me that my previous care had been medically sound and that we could continue with the same protocol. She asked if there were any concerns about my previous treatment, and I briefly explained that there had been a personal conflict that made it impossible to continue with my former doctor. Meanwhile, my wife's relationship with my former oncologist became increasingly public. They were spotted together at restaurants and coffee shops around town, holding hands and acting like a couple. Word spread quickly through the medical community and among our mutual friends. I received awkward phone calls from people who'd heard rumors and wanted to know if they were true. The humiliation was almost as difficult to bear as the cancer itself. I decided to file a complaint with the Medical Ethics Board about my former oncologist's conduct. I researched the professional standards for doctor-patient relationships and discovered that pursuing a romantic relationship with a patient's spouse while actively treating that patient was a clear violation of medical ethics. The boundaries that existed to protect patients and their families had been crossed in the most egregious way possible. The complaint process was more straightforward than I'd expected. The Medical Ethics Board took my concerns seriously and launched an investigation into my former oncologist's conduct. They interviewed me extensively about the timeline of events, the development of the relationship, and the impact on my care. I provided text messages, appointment records, and witness statements from other patients who'd observed inappropriate behavior during my treatment sessions. The investigation revealed that my case wasn't isolated. The ethics board discovered that my former oncologist had a pattern of developing inappropriate relationships with vulnerable patients and their family members. Several other complaints had been filed over the years, but none had been substantiated until my case provided the evidence they needed. The board interviewed other patients and families who came forward with similar stories of boundary violations and unprofessional conduct. The hearing process took several months, during which time my former oncologist was suspended from practicing medicine. He hired an expensive attorney who tried to argue that his relationship with my wife developed after my treatment was completed, but the timeline evidence clearly showed that the affair began while I was still an active patient. The attorney also tried to claim that the relationship was consensual and didn't impact my medical care, but the ethics board wasn't buying that argument. During my testimony at the hearing, I explained how the affair had affected my trust in the medical system and my ability to focus on my recovery. I described the emotional trauma of discovering that my doctor was more interested in pursuing my wife than in providing professional medical care. I talked about feeling abandoned and betrayed during the most vulnerable period of my life, when I should have been able to trust my medical team completely. The Medical Ethics Board's decision was swift and decisive. They found my former oncologist guilty of multiple violations of professional conduct, including inappropriate relationships with patients' family members, breach of professional boundaries, and conduct unbecoming of a medical professional. He was stripped of his medical license permanently, with no possibility of reinstatement. The board also recommended that he be reported to the State Medical Board and the American Medical Association. The fallout from the ethics board decision was immediate and severe. My former oncologist's medical career was effectively over, and he faced potential civil lawsuits from other patients who'd been affected by his unprofessional conduct. The cancer center where he'd worked terminated his employment and launched their own internal investigation into his behavior. His reputation in the medical community was destroyed, and he became a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries. My wife's reaction to the ethics board decision was complicated. She was angry that I'd filed the complaint, claiming that I was being vindictive and trying to ruin her relationship out of spite. She argued that their love was genuine and that I was using the medical system to get revenge on them. But I could also see the doubt creeping into her eyes as she realized the full extent of what had happened and how it looked from the outside. The relationship between my wife and my former oncologist didn't survive the professional scandal. The stress of the ethics investigation, the loss of his career, and the public humiliation took a toll on their romance. My wife began to see him differently when he was no longer the confident, successful doctor she'd fallen in love with. Instead, he became a disgraced former physician who'd thrown away his career for an affair. The power dynamic that had initially attracted her to him had completely reversed. Within 6 months of the ethics board decision, my wife contacted me to say that her relationship with my former oncologist had ended. She was struggling financially and emotionally, having burned bridges with many of our mutual friends and family members. She asked if we could meet to discuss the possibility of reconciliation, claiming that she'd made a terrible mistake and wanted to try to rebuild our marriage. I agreed to meet with her, but not because I was interested in reconciliation. I wanted closure and the opportunity to tell her how her actions had affected me during the most difficult period of my life. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown where we'd had our first date years earlier. She looked different than I remembered, older and more worn down by the stress of the past year. She apologized for her actions and tried to explain her motivations, but her words felt hollow and self-serving. She claimed that she'd been overwhelmed by the pressure of being a caregiver, and that she'd made poor decisions because she wasn't thinking clearly. She said she'd realized that what she'd felt for my former oncologist wasn't real love, but rather a desperate attempt to escape the reality of my illness and our changed circumstances. I listened to her explanation but felt no desire to forgive or reconcile. The betrayal had cut too deep, and I'd learned to live without her during my recovery. I discovered strength I didn't know I possessed and had built a new life that didn't include her. I told her that while I appreciated her apology, I couldn't go back to the way things were before. Too much had happened and too much trust had been broken. The conversation was civil but final. We discussed the practical matters of our divorce, including the division of assets and the sale of our house. She didn't contest the divorce or ask for alimony, perhaps recognizing that her actions had forfeited any claim to those things. We agreed to handle the proceedings as amicably as possible, and she signed the papers without protest. My cancer treatment was ultimately successful, and I've been in remission for over 2 years now. The experience taught me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, and that I could survive not just cancer but also the destruction of my marriage. I learned to advocate for myself in medical settings and to trust my instincts when something didn't feel right. The betrayal by my wife and doctor was devastating, but it also showed me who I really was when everything else was stripped away. I've since remarried a woman who stood by me during my recovery and legal battles with the Medical Ethics Board. She's a nurse who understands the medical world but maintains appropriate professional boundaries. She was there for me during some of my darkest moments, and our relationship is built on mutual respect and genuine love. We've created a life together that's based on honesty and trust, qualities that I'd taken for granted in my previous marriage. The former oncologist never returned to medicine and eventually left town to start over somewhere else. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd taken a job in pharmaceutical sales, a career that wouldn't require a medical license. His fall from grace was complete, and he became a cautionary tale told in medical schools about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and ethical conduct. My former wife struggled for several years after our divorce, dealing with the social consequences of her actions and the financial challenges of starting over. She eventually moved to another state to escape the stigma and begin a new life. I occasionally hear updates about her through mutual friends, but I've chosen not to maintain any contact with her. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. The experience taught me valuable lessons about resilience, self-advocacy, and the importance of maintaining hope even in the darkest circumstances. I learned that cancer was just one challenge I had to face, not the defining moment of my life. The betrayal by my wife and doctor was in many ways more difficult to overcome than the cancer itself, but surviving both experiences made me stronger and more confident in my ability to handle whatever life throws at me. I still get regular checkups and blood work to monitor my health, but I approach these appointments with a different mindset now. I'm an active participant in my healthcare rather than a passive recipient of treatment. I ask questions, seek second opinions when necessary, and maintain clear boundaries with my medical team. I've learned that being a patient doesn't mean surrendering your autonomy or your right to expect professional conduct from your healthcare providers. The Medical Ethics Board case became a precedent for similar situations, and I've been contacted by other patients who have faced comparable challenges. I've tried to help them navigate the complaint process and understand their rights when medical professionals cross ethical boundaries. It's been rewarding to turn my negative experience into something that could help others protect themselves from similar betrayals. Looking back, I realized that the cancer diagnosis was actually a blessing in disguise. It revealed the true character of the people in my life and forced me to confront truths about my marriage that I'd been avoiding for years. My wife's affair wasn't just about my illness. It was about fundamental character flaws that would have eventually surfaced in other ways. The crisis simply accelerated the inevitable end of our relationship. The strength I discovered during my cancer treatment has served me well in other areas of my life. I've become more confident in my career, more selective about my relationships, and more willing to stand up for myself when faced with unfair treatment. The experience taught me that I could survive almost anything and that adversity, while painful, could also be a source of growth and self-discovery. I've also become an advocate for patient rights and medical ethics reform. I've spoken at conferences about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries and the devastating impact that ethical violations can have on patients and their families. I've worked with medical schools to develop better training programs for healthcare providers about appropriate relationships with patients and their families. The cancer center where I received treatment has implemented new policies and procedures based on my experience and the ethics board findings. They've established clearer guidelines for staff interactions with patients and their families, and they've created a more robust system for reporting and investigating potential boundary violations. My case became a catalyst for positive change in the medical community. My current marriage is everything my first marriage wasn't. We communicate openly about our feelings and concerns, we support each other through difficult times without losing ourselves in the process, and we maintain our individual identities while building a life together. We've discussed what we learned from our previous relationships and how we can avoid repeating the same mistakes. Our relationship is built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect that I never fully appreciated until it was absent from my life. The financial settlement from the ethics board case and subsequent civil litigation helped me rebuild my life after the divorce. While money couldn't undo the emotional damage, it provided security and options that I might not have had otherwise. I used part of the settlement to establish a scholarship fund for cancer patients who need financial assistance during treatment, turning my negative experience into something that could help others facing similar challenges. I've maintained relationships with some of the other patients I met during my treatment, and we've formed an informal support group that meets regularly. We share our experiences, offer encouragement to newly diagnosed patients, and celebrate milestones like anniversaries of remission. These friendships have been invaluable in helping me process my experiences and maintain perspective on what really matters in life. The house my former wife and I shared was sold as part of the divorce settlement, and I used my portion of the proceeds to buy a smaller place that felt more like home than the house where I'd received my diagnosis and discovered my wife's affair. Starting fresh in a new environment helped me move forward emotionally and create new memories that weren't tainted by the betrayal and trauma of my cancer treatment. My relationship with my family improved significantly after the divorce. My parents and siblings had never been comfortable with my former wife's behavior during my treatment, but they'd kept their concerns to themselves to avoid adding stress to my situation. Once the truth came out, they were incredibly supportive and helped me through the recovery process. Their unwavering support reminded me that I wasn't alone, even when I felt most abandoned. The experience also changed my perspective on what constitutes success and happiness. Before my diagnosis, I'd been focused on career advancement and material possessions. The cancer and subsequent betrayal taught me that health, relationships, and personal integrity were far more valuable than any professional achievement or financial gain. I've since prioritized these things in my life and found greater satisfaction and contentment than I'd ever experienced before. I've also become more selective about the people I allow into my inner circle. The betrayal by my wife and doctor taught me that trust is earned through consistent actions over time, not just words or promises. I've learned to pay attention to red flags and to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right in a relationship. This has helped me avoid similar situations and surround myself with people who genuinely care about my well-being. The legal proceedings and ethics board case were emotionally draining, but they also provided a sense of justice and closure that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Seeing my former oncologist held accountable for his actions and losing his medical license felt like vindication for the pain and suffering he'd caused. It also sent a message to other medical professionals that such behavior would not be tolerated or ignored. My new wife has been incredibly understanding about my past experiences and the impact they've had on my ability to trust. She's patient with my occasional moments of doubt or insecurity, and she's helped me heal from the trauma of betrayal. Our relationship has shown me what a healthy partnership looks like and has helped me recognize the warning signs I'd missed in my previous marriage. The cancer treatment itself was successful, but the emotional scars from the betrayal took longer to heal than the physical effects of chemotherapy. I've learned to manage the lingering trust issues and to communicate openly about my fears and concerns. Therapy wasn't an option I pursued, but I found healing through building new relationships, focusing on my health, and channeling my experience into advocacy work. Today, I'm healthier and happier than I've ever been. My cancer remains in remission, my marriage is strong and supportive, and I've found purpose in helping others who face similar challenges. The betrayal that once seemed like the end of my world became the catalyst for building a better life than I'd ever imagined possible. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us end up being the best things that ever happened to us, even if we can't see it at the time.